Dawson City, Yukon Territory, January 14, 1898. The thermometer nailed to the trading post wall read -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was falling fast. The sun was a pale, useless coin hovering over the horizon, providing light but absolutely no heat. Down by the frozen banks of the Yukon River, the sound of hammering echoed like gunshots in the thin, dry air. Most men were frantically chinking their log cabins, jamming moss and mud into the gaps between green timber, praying the mixture wouldn't freeze and crumble before nightfall. They were building fortresses of wood, relying on the sheer mass of timber to keep the Klondike winter at bay. But Elias Thorne was doing something else, and the whole town was watching him with a mixture of pity and amusement. Elias wasn't building a cabin, he was wrestling with canvas. He had set up a standard 10 by 12 wall tent, but then, he did something that made the seasoned trappers stop their work and point. He erected a second frame, slightly larger than the first, draped a second canvas sheet over it, and began shovel-feeding a mountain of dry sawdust into the 4-inch gap between the two layers. From the outside, the structure looked ridiculous. As the sawdust filled the void, the canvas walls bulged outward. It didn't look like a shelter. It looked like a bloated white tick about to burst. It was lumpy, misshapen, and swayed slightly in the wind. Silas Vane, a logger from Oregon who prided himself on his airtight spruce cabin, leaned on his axe and laughed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Hey, Thorne," Silas shouted, his voice carrying over the frozen mud. "You building a house or stuffing a Christmas goose? That thing's gonna rot from the inside out before February. One heavy snow and that stuffed turkey is gonna collapse right on top of you." The other men laughed. It was a deep, nervous laughter, the kind men use to hide their own fear of the coming cold. They looked at Elias's puffy, soft-sided tent, and then back at their solid 8-inch thick timber walls. To them, survival meant hardness. It meant weight. It meant wood. Elias didn't look up. He just kept pouring the sawdust, tamping it down with a long stick, ensuring the gap was filled from the frozen ground all the way to the ridgepole. He knew something they didn't. He knew that in the battle against thermodynamics, hardness doesn't matter. Only the air matters. And by the time the great freeze of '98 hit 2 weeks later, Silas Vane wouldn't be laughing. He would be shivering violently in his solid wooden cabin, wondering why the man in the stuffed turkey tent was sitting in his shirt sleeves, warm as toast. This is the story of how a forgotten piece of insulation engineering humiliated the toughest men on the frontier. To understand why Elias Thorne was willing to bet his life on a pile of wood shavings, you have to look at his hands. They weren't the calloused hands of a logger or a miner. Before the gold rush, Elias had worked the ice harvest in Massachusetts for the Frederick Tudor Ice Company. For 10 years, his job was keeping ice frozen in the middle of July. He had seen blocks of ice cut from New England ponds, packed into ships, and sailed all the way to India across the scorching equator. When the ships arrived in Calcutta months later, the ice was still there. The secret wasn't the wood of the ship's hull. It was the sawdust packed between the hulls. Elias understood a principle of physics that the loggers in Dawson City ignored. Thermal conductivity. Wood is a decent insulator, but it is solid. Solids conduct energy. If you heat one side of a log, eventually, the heat travels through the grain and escapes to the cold side. But sawdust. Sawdust is chaotic. It is cellular. It is millions of tiny pockets of trapped air. In engineering terms, this is called a dead air space. Heat struggles to move through air that isn't moving by packing the sawdust tight enough to stop the air from circulating, but loose enough to maintain those air pockets. Elias was creating a thermal break, a barrier that stopped heat transfer dead in its tracks. He wasn't building a wall. He was building a vacuum flask. While his neighbors were obsessed with the strength of their shelter, Elias was obsessed with the envelope of his. He knew that the enemy wasn't the weight of the snow. The enemy was the second law of thermodynamics. Heat always moves to cold, and he was building a trap to stop it. If you enjoy uncovering the lost survival technologies of history, do me a favor and click subscribe. We dig up the manuals the pioneers used to survive, so you can learn what they knew. Now, back to the Yukon. The real test came on January 28th. The weather turned violent. A high-pressure system stalled over the valley, sucking the moisture out of the air and dropping the temperature to a bone-shattering -45 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the physics of survival change. Exposed skin freezes in less than 2 minutes. Steel becomes brittle and snaps. Kerosene turns into jelly. In the timber cabins, the ideal frontier home's disaster was setting in. Silas Vane sat in his cabin, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, huddled just 2 feet from his cast-iron stove. The stove was glowing cherry red, consuming wood at a terrifying rate. Yet, Silas could see his own breath. The problem was the thermal bridging. The solid logs of his cabin were acting as bridges, carrying the precious heat from his stove directly through the walls and dumping it outside. The corners of the room, where the logs interlocked, were covered in white hoarfrost on the inside. Worse, the chinking, the mud and moss he had packed between the logs had frozen, contracted, and cracked. The wind was screaming through microscopic fissures in the walls. This created a draft, a phenomenon known as the stack effect. As the hot air from his stove rose and escaped through the roof, it created a vacuum that sucked frigid -45 air in through the cracks at the bottom logs. Silas was trapped in a convection engine. The harder he ran his stove, the faster the cold air was sucked in to replace the rising heat. His feet were numb. His water bucket was a solid block of ice. He was burning 4 cords of wood a month and still freezing to death. Across the clearing, the wind howled against Elias Thorne's tent. The stuffed turkey looked even stranger now. The outer canvas was stiff with frost, vibrating in the gale. But inside, it was silent. Elias sat at a small table, repairing a snowshoe. He was wearing a flannel shirt. No coat, no gloves. The thermometer hanging from his ridgepole read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference was the sawdust. The torrential layer of packed shavings acted as a continuous thermal blanket. There were no studs to conduct the cold. There were no cracks for the wind to penetrate. The sawdust packing was flexible. As the wind hit the tent, the walls shifted slightly, but the insulation integrity never broke. Because the inner canvas was permeable, humidity from cooking and breathing slowly migrated through the fabric and into the sawdust, where it dissipated outward, keeping the interior dry. In Silas's cabin, that moisture was freezing onto the walls. In Elias's tent, the walls were warm to the touch. Elias put another small log into his stove. He wasn't burning cords of wood. He was burning mere armfuls. His efficiency was nearly 300% higher than the log cabins surrounding him. The mockery had stopped days ago. Now, there was only the silence of the cold, and the smoke rising lazily from Elias's pipe. The breaking point for the skeptics came 3 days into the deep freeze. Silas Vane's supply of dry firewood was critical. He had burned through his reserve, trying to keep the drafty cabin above freezing. Desperate, and swallowing his pride, he trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the bloated tent. He reached the flap of Elias's tent. The outer canvas was cold and hard as a board. Silas banged his gloved fist against the doorframe. "Thorne, you alive in there? Come in, Silas. Don't let the heat out." Elias's voice came from inside, calm and steady. Silas unlaced the outer flap, then the inner flap. He stepped through the airlock entry. The moment he crossed the threshold, he staggered back as if he'd been punched. It wasn't a physical blow, it was a thermal one. The wall of heat hit his frozen face with such intensity it made his eyes water. The air smelled of pine, sawdust, and coffee. Not smoke, not damp wool. Coffee. Silas stood there, blinking, his brain struggling to process the data. He looked at the stove. It was damped down, burning low. He looked at Elias, who was calmly pouring a cup of dark liquid. "Close the flap, Silas," Elias said gently. Silas turned and sealed the canvas. He pulled off his heavy bear hide mittens. He felt the blood rushing back into his fingers, painful and sharp. He looked at the walls, the bulging, ugly canvas walls that he had laughed at. He placed his hand against the inner canvas. It was warm. How? Silas rasped, his voice rough from days of breathing sub-zero air. "My stove is twice the size of yours. My walls are 8 inches of spruce. I'm freezing to death. Thorne, how is it 60 degrees in a tent?" Elias handed him the coffee. "You built a wall, Silas. I built a coat. Let's pause the narrative here to break down the hard physics and math of why the sawdust tent decimated the log cabin in thermal performance. This isn't magic, it is raw engineering. We need to talk about R value. R value is the measure of a material's resistance to heat flow. The higher the number, the better the insulation. Softwood logs, like the spruce Silas used, have an R value of roughly 1.4 per inch. So, an 8-inch log wall theoretically gives you an R value of about R11. That sounds decent on paper. However, logs are round. The wall isn't a uniform, 8 inches thick. It thins at the joints. Furthermore, the chinking the mud mortar has a very poor R value, often less than R0.5 per inch. When you average the thermal bridging of the wood and the heat loss through the chinking, the effective R value of a pioneer log cabin was often closer to R6 or R7. Now, look at Elias's stuffed turkey. Dry sawdust has an R value of approximately R2.5 to R3 per inch, depending on how tightly it is packed. Elias created a continuous 4-inch gap. 4 inches x R3 equals R12. On paper, R12 is nearly double the effective R value of the cabin. But the numbers don't stop there. We have to factor in air infiltration. A log cabin is rigid. When the temperature drops, wood shrinks. When wood shrinks, cracks open. A wind speed of 20 miles per hour can reduce the effective R value of a log wall by 50% due to cold air driving into those cracks. The sawdust tent is a monolithic insulation envelope. The sawdust settles. If a void opens, gravity pulls more sawdust down to fill it. It is self-healing insulation. The canvas is windproof but vapor permeable. So, while Silas was fighting an R6 wall that leaked air like a sieve, Elias was living inside an R12 airtight capsule. But the biggest factor, thermal mass versus insulation. Silas's logs had high thermal mass. They absorbed heat. When Silas lit his stove, the first few hours of heat didn't warm the air. They went into heating the frozen logs. The logs were a heat sink, stealing energy from the room. Elias's sawdust had low thermal mass but high resistance. The moment he lit his stove, the heat stayed in the air. The walls reflected the energy back into the room almost instantly. In a survival situation, you don't want to heat the neighborhood. You want to heat the air touching your skin. Elias understood that isolation is more valuable than mass. The aftermath of the Great Freeze changed the architecture of the camp. When spring arrived and the thaw finally broke the stranglehold of winter, Silas Vane didn't tear down his cabin, but he did modify it. He spent 2 weeks building a secondary wall frame around the exterior of his log cabin, leaving a 6-inch gap. He then spent days hauling sawdust from the mill, filling that gap until his cabin looked just as bloated and strange as Elias's tent. He wasn't the only one. By the winter of 1899, the sawdust wall became a common sight in the Klondike. The mockery had vanished, replaced by the quiet, pragmatic respect that the frontier forces upon men. They realized that tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. Just because their grandfathers built log cabins didn't mean it was the best way to survive minus 40 degrees. Elias Thorne didn't just survive the winter, he thrived in it. He proved that survival isn't about being the toughest, the strongest, or the one with the biggest axe. It's about being the one who understands how the world actually works. Today, we use this same principle in modern high-performance homes. We call it blown-in, cellulose insulation, or double stud wall construction. Architects win awards for passive house designs that use thick, continuous layers of insulation to heat homes with nothing more than body heat and a light bulb. But in 1898, they didn't call it passive house architecture, they called it the stuffed turkey, and it was the only thing standing between a man and the freezing darkness. The frontier didn't reward tradition, it rewarded what worked. If you're planning to build your own shelter, or if you just want to understand the physics of survival, remember Elias Thorne. Don't just build a wall, build an envelope. I'm the frontier historian. Stay warm, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next storm. Would you like me to help you visualize the difference in insulation properties between sawdust and solid timber with a comparative table?